John Harkness was not just any man. He was a skilled mechanic and a committed Marine who stood out among his peers for his dedication and bravery. His decision to volunteer to serve in Indochina in 1967 was no surprise to those who knew him well, particularly his wife, Sandra. They had been married for 3 years, living in a small, comfortable house and planning to start a family. Sandra worked as a paralegal, and between their incomes, they were doing well financially with a healthy savings account for emergencies. When John told Sandra about his plans to serve in Indochina, she cried but understood his strong sense of duty. John was a tough man, muscular and known for his fighting prowess, but marrying his high school sweetheart had calmed him. Even so, he could still defend himself when necessary. Their last night together before he left was passionate, filled with both love and the unspoken fears of separation. "You'd better come back in one piece," Sandra said, her voice tinged with worry. "And don't go after other women. This is mine, only mine," she added, her hand possessively grabbing his crotch. John chuckled, pulling her close. "Don't worry, sweetie," he said. "I'll take good care of myself, and you'd better behave while I'm away. I know how those wealthy lawyers are." "No problem, sweetie," she replied, her tone playful yet sincere. "I promise to be good." Before leaving, John updated his will and set up automatic payments from his military salary to cover the mortgage and utilities. He also treated himself to a new tattoo reading, "Death Before Dishonor," a testament to his unyielding principles. In Vietnam, John quickly proved his worth as a fireteam leader. Initially, some doubted him because he was a reservist, but after several combat engagements, he earned their respect. Unlike many Marines, John avoided local women, staying faithful to Sandra despite teasing from Lance Corporal Harker. Harker often warned him about Jody, a term for men who took advantage of military wives while their husbands were deployed, but John trusted Sandra completely. John wrote to Sandra as often as possible, cherishing her letters. However, after a few months, her letters became less frequent, a change that gnawed at him. He found it odd, especially as he started receiving more letters from his parents, including photos of Sandra in a swimsuit he hadn't seen before. He couldn't help but wonder who had taken them. By Christmas, when he received nothing from Sandra but a card and letter from his parents, concern began to fester, though he remained focused on his duties in Vietnam. In January 1968, as rumors spread, John's deployment to Vietnam was intense from the start. As a fireteam leader, he quickly earned the respect of his fellow Marines, despite being a reservist. His commitment and courage in several combat engagements silenced any doubts about his abilities. While many Marines indulged in the temptations of local women, John remained steadfastly faithful to Sandra, brushing off the teasing from Lance Corporal Harker, who often warned him about Jody, the slang term for men who would take advantage of military wives while their husbands were deployed. John's loyalty to Sandra was unwavering, and he wrote to her as often as possible, cherishing the letters she sent in return. At first, her letters came every 2 weeks like clockwork, bringing a sense of normalcy and comfort amidst the chaos of war. But as the months passed, the letters became less frequent, and John couldn't shake the unease that settled in his gut. The silence from Sandra was unsettling, especially as he started receiving more letters from his parents instead, even photos of Sandra in a swimsuit he had never seen before, leaving him to wonder who had taken them. Christmas came, and with it, a card and letter from his parents, but nothing from Sandra. Though concerned, John pushed the worry aside, staying focused on his duties in Vietnam. In mid-January 1968, the tension in the air was palpable as rumors spread of an impending major attack by the enemy around the Tet Lunar New Year. At the end of the month, all hell broke loose. John's position was heavily attacked, and the fighting was fierce and relentless. Most of John's team, including Harker, didn't make it. John himself was severely injured, but he continued to fight until they were finally evacuated to Da Nang, and then to a military hospital in San Francisco. The doctors managed to save his leg, though the road to recovery would be long. The bullet had narrowly missed major organs, and stitches now adorned his cheek. His ear was bandaged, and though the nurses told him the scar gave him a distinguished look, John wasn't so sure. His time in Vietnam was over. A Marine officer awarded him a Purple Heart and informed him he was being recommended for a Silver Star. It was a bittersweet moment. John already had a Bronze Star with a Combat V and a Navy Commendation Medal, but the loss of his comrades weighed heavily on his heart. When John's parents met him in San Francisco, his thoughts immediately turned to Sandra. He wondered if she even knew he was back in the States. His father, a veteran himself, tried to lighten the mood. "Damn, son. I thought I taught you how to duck," he joked. But the humor couldn't mask the concern in his voice. John's mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Sandra?" John asked, his voice laced with worry. His parents exchanged uneasy glances before his father finally spoke. "I honestly don't know, John. We tried calling the house and her office, but they kept saying she was out, and she never called back. I haven't seen her in weeks. I went by every weekend to maintain the yard and check on her, but nothing." John's heart sank. Tell him, Bob's mother urged softly. John's father hesitated before continuing. The last time I saw Sandra was about 2.5 months ago. I was driving up the street to your house and saw a guy leaving. He got into a sports car, a Corvette, I think, and sped off. Sandra was standing at the door in a bathrobe, waving goodbye to him. She didn't say anything when I arrived. I haven't seen her since then. I've been picking up the papers and collecting your mail when I go by. I'm sorry, son. John felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had trusted Sandra implicitly, never doubting her loyalty. Now, the realization of her betrayal hit him like a freight train. Was it a blue Corvette? John asked, his voice hollow. His father nodded. Yes, it was. Do you know who owns it? Yeah, John replied, his voice tight with anger. It belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her firm. So she isn't even home long enough to pick up the mail. It doesn't seem like it, Bob said quietly. I hope you don't mind, but I saw a couple of utility and phone bills marked final notice, so I took care of them. I figured you wouldn't want to come home to a house without power or phone service. Thanks, Dad, John said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll pay you back when I get home, I promise. Don't worry about it, son, Bob replied, his voice filled with concern. Just focus on getting better. Don't stress about this until you're ready. If you want, I can look into getting a power of attorney. If she's not handling the bills, who knows what else she might have done? For all we know, she might have already cleaned you out. John's mind was reeling, but he knew he needed to stay calm and think clearly. He asked a nurse to help him find a military lawyer, and soon a Navy lieutenant commander arrived to take notes as John and his parents explained the situation. The officer took out some papers from his briefcase. I'll get these papers prepared for you, Corporal, the lawyer said. They will give your parents special powers of attorney to handle the issues you mentioned. I suggest you see a family law attorney in your home state as soon as possible. I'll have the paperwork ready, and we can meet here this afternoon to sign and notarize it. Thank you, Sir John replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. After the lawyer left, Bob turned to his son with a serious expression. As soon as we get home, John, I'll check the bank to see what's going on. I still have the house key you gave me, so I'll stop by and check on things there. You know, George Williams, who retired from the police force a couple of months ago, is now working as a private investigator. I can ask him to look into this if you want, Bob offered. I'm not sure I can afford a private investigator, Dad, John said, though the idea of finding out the truth gnawed at him. Bob shook his head. Don't worry about it, son. George owes me a few favors. We worked together for 13 years on the force. Also, I'll talk to our family lawyer. I think he still handles family law cases. John nodded, grateful for his father's support. But the emotional weight of Sandra's betrayal was almost unbearable. He felt like a fool for trusting her so completely. Dad, you've lost men in combat, right? John asked, though he already knew the answer. His father had served as a second lieutenant with the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He knew all too well the pain of loss. Yes, son, I have, Bob said solemnly. This might sound odd, Dad, but have you ever had dreams where they spoke to you? John asked hesitantly. Oh yes, Bob replied, a hint of sadness in his voice. At first it was almost every night, but it became less frequent over time. Have you ever gotten over it? John asked, knowing deep down that the answer wouldn't be simple. You never completely get over it, Bob said softly. It becomes a part of you. You have to make peace with it and learn to live with it, or it will consume you. The next 2 weeks flew by for John as he focused on his recovery and tried to keep his mind off Sandra. His parents called him daily with updates, but there was no word from Sandra herself. He learned that she had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant by him. Everyone at her office knew about the affair, and the divorce process was already in motion. John's lawyer, Mike McGregor, was handling everything, filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery and abandonment. He was also pursuing legal action against Eric for interfering with John's marriage and against Sandra's employer for failing to uphold their moral standards. One day, John's father called with more bad news. John, Sandra drained almost all of your checking and savings accounts about 2 months ago. She took out $8,545 from your savings in cash. The only deposits since then have been from your military pay. John clenched his fists in anger, his knuckles turning white. Take her name off the account, Dad. We don't have any credit cards, so that's not an issue. Bob agreed and continued with the update. I went by the house, son. It's a mess. There's moldy food on the table, dishes piled up in the sink, and it smells terrible. It looks like she took all her clothes and personal stuff but left her wedding dress and album behind. I found her wedding and engagement rings in the bathroom trash. I'm sorry, John. John's heart ached with a deep, gnawing pain, but he steeled himself. At least the house is still standing, he said, trying to find some solace in the small mercy. Yeah, Bob replied, his voice heavy with concern. Your mother is there now, cleaning up and airing out the place. The bed is a mess. The sheets are badly stained. If I had to guess, Sandra probably had someone else in there. What do you want to do about it? Get rid of it, John said firmly. Dispose of it and pile it up outside if you need to. I'll manage with a cot if I have to. Bob agreed, his heart breaking for his son. All right, I'll handle it, he said. By the way, George offered to take your case for free. He said nothing is worse than someone who steals a soldier's wife while he's serving his country. I also found a top-notch lawyer who's agreed to handle your divorce for free. He can't stand Swagman, who apparently has a reputation for going after married women. George suggested we change all the locks on your house, and I agree. Are you okay with that? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, Dad, John replied, feeling a small measure of relief knowing his father and George were looking out for him. A few hours later, the attorney returned with a notary. After signing the necessary papers, John's parents left, promising to call with any new developments. John was finally alone, left to confront the mess his life had become. As he rested, his thoughts drifted not to Sandra, but to the fallen Marines he had fought alongside. Their faces haunted his dreams, a stark reminder of the sacrifices they had all made. Days passed, and the emotional scars from both the war and Sandra's betrayal began to weigh heavily on John. He threw himself into his recovery, learning to move around with a crutch and cane. The doctors eventually removed his cast, and he was cleared to drive an automatic car. Back in his hospital room, an orderly brought in his cleaned uniforms, now adorned with sergeant stripes. A doctor explained that he had been promoted and would soon be discharged, with physical therapy arranged at a VA facility near his home. John dressed in his freshly starched green uniform, grabbed his polished boots, and, with the help of a wheelchair and cane, made his way to the day room. He was surprised to see his parents, doctors, nurses, orderlies, and his reserve battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Irvin Johnson, waiting for him. With great effort, John stood up with the help of his cane, surprising everyone in the room. He shook Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's hand, who then announced John's promotion to sergeant, expressing pride in John's loyalty and abilities. The colonel joked, "And may God have mercy on your soul," causing everyone to laugh. John's parents proudly pinned the new stripes on his uniform, their faces beaming with pride. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson then read a citation awarding John the Silver Star Medal for his bravery in Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, as a fire team leader near Da Nang, John led his team against overwhelming enemy forces, continuing to fight despite being wounded. His leadership and courage had significantly contributed to the defense of Da Nang, upholding the highest standards of the Marine Corps and the Navy. The colonel pinned the medal on John's chest, thanked him for his service, and noted that his experience would be invaluable for training troops. John's mother hugged him with tears in her eyes, while his father, a man who had seen and endured so much, wiped away a tear and expressed his pride in his son. Later, after packing his sea bag, John changed into his Class C uniform, a short-sleeved khaki shirt and green trousers. His parents waited for him in the lobby as they prepared to leave for the airport. As they wheeled him through the terminal, John encountered a group of long-haired protesters who sneered at him, calling him a baby killer. Without hesitation, he gave them the finger, earning disapproving looks from some bystanders but feeling an immense sense of satisfaction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John was back in his house. It no longer felt like a home since Sandra had betrayed him, but he appreciated the privacy. His parents had stocked the fridge with beer and snacks, and his mother had prepared his favorite dishes, including her famous lasagna. As he put away his gear, he found a large Bowie-style knife at the bottom of his sea bag, a relic he had found in Vietnam. The blade was rusty but clean and oiled, with a leather scabbard stamped with a winged creature holding a sword, and the words March au Crève. He valued it and promised to find out its origins. John called his lawyer, Mike McGregor, and George to set up a meeting for that afternoon. After a short rest, he checked on his pickup truck in the garage. It seemed in working condition, though he planned to do an oil change and tune-up soon. After inspecting his place, he grabbed a beer and sank into his recliner, his leg aching as he tried to relax. He turned on the TV, eventually settling on a game show for some background noise. He called Wilkins, his old boss, to let him know he was finally back. "It's about damn time you got back," Wilkins said gruffly. "When do you think you can start working?" John explained the situation with Sandra and what the doctor had said about his physical therapy. "No problem, son. Take the time you need to handle your stuff," Wilkins replied. "If you need to go to court or see the doctor, that's fine. I'm just glad you're home. Most of these kids don't even know the difference between a brake pad and a carburetor sometimes. If you can make it over here sometime this week, I've got a little welcome home gift for you." "Yeah, thanks," John said before ending the call. Finally, Mike and George arrived, and John let them in, shaking their hands and offering them a beer. They accepted the offer and settled into the living room. "It's good to see you back," George said. "Your dad told me about your medal. Congrats, you earned it. Anyway, let's get to it. I've got something you need to hear." George pulled out a small reel-to-reel tape recorder with the tape already loaded. "Let me set this up for you," he said. "I've been keeping track of Sandra and Eric from the start. I followed them one night to a steakhouse on the edge of town and managed to sit right across from them. I'm not sure if they saw me, but they didn't notice the microphone hidden in the plants between our booths. There will be some background noise from waitresses and such, but you can clearly hear their conversation." He started the tape and turned up the volume. As the voices of Sandra and Eric filled the room, John's blood ran cold. The conversation was filled with talk of betrayal, manipulation, and a plan to deceive John into raising Eric's child. Sandra sounded hesitant but was clearly being pressured by Eric. "Come on, babe. If anyone can do it, it's you." Eric's smug voice echoed through the room. "He's probably drowning his sorrows right now. I bet he'd do anything to have you back." "You don't know John very well, Eric. His sense of ethics wouldn't let him accept this. There's no way he'll agree to raise the baby as his, and he definitely won't share me with you," Sandra replied, her voice laced with uncertainty. "No, he wouldn't share you. We won't let him. Look, you know I'm not cut out to be a father. John would be a better parent than me. Here's the plan. We get him to agree to our terms, or we threaten him with a divorce. We'll demand his house, half his income, alimony, and child support." "Don't worry, I've already prepared the paperwork," Eric said. George paused the tape, his eyes meeting John's. "So, they really think I'm going to let her stay with him, and let him raise her illegitimate child?" John asked, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. "They're out of their minds," George replied, shaking his head. "But there's more." George restarted the tape, and John's stomach churned as the conversation took a darker turn. Eric began discussing more sinister options, suggesting that if John refused to cooperate, they could resort to more extreme measures, hinting at possible harm to John. "You're not going to hurt him, are you?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling. "Don't worry," Eric replied, his tone cold. "I know people who could help with that. You'd be in the clear. If something happens to him, you'd get everything and be free of him." John's anger boiled over. "That's a plan to commit murder," he said, his voice barely containing his rage. Mike nodded in agreement. "It's also a conspiracy to commit fraud and possibly theft since Sandra drained your bank accounts," he said. "That's why I filed the court papers on the way over and pushed for a quick hearing. I also got an order of protection that keeps them at least 100 feet away from you, your house, and your parents. I know the person who schedules these things, so I'll be serving them with papers tomorrow morning. I spoke with the district attorney, and he's putting together a criminal case against them. I also talked to Lee Marcus, the senior partner at their firm. We've been friends for a long time, and he's furious about what they're doing. I told him we plan to sue the firm and mention the conspiracy to engage in criminal activity. By the time we're done, Swagman will be lucky to avoid jail." George added, "Your dad and I still have connections in the police department, including the chief. I've spoken with a few of them, and they've agreed to keep an eye out for you." John was overwhelmed but grateful for the support. "What am I asking for in the divorce, exactly?" he asked. Mike handed him a folder with all the documents. "Sorry, I forgot your dad was acting on your behalf," Mike said. "Here's the paperwork. As I mentioned, we're filing for divorce based on adultery and abandonment. Since Sandra has a higher income, there won't be any alimony. You'll keep the house and everything in it because she left it and didn't pay any of the utilities. We're also demanding that she return $7,100, which is half of your joint accounts. Remember, she emptied both your checking and savings accounts and took all the money you had deposited. We're also asking that she return her rings and change back to her maiden name. She'll keep her clothes and her car. I've asked Lee to keep her employed since she'll need some support during her pregnancy. From what we know, Swagman has just under $1 million, so we're suing him for $800,000. With that, his court costs and attorney fees for both this case and any criminal charges, he'll be nearly bankrupt. We're also asking the firm to pay $2 million for not enforcing their morals clause. We'll probably settle for around half that amount to avoid bad publicity." Mike paused for a moment before adding, "One last thing, John. Do you have a set of dress blues?" "Yeah," John replied. Mike nodded. "Great. Get them cleaned and have all your medals and ribbons mounted. Wear them to court when the trial starts. I want everyone to see what kind of man Sandra and Eric have wronged. I have one more surprise for them, but I'll keep that to myself for now." John agreed, feeling a sense of determination building inside him. "That's fine with me," he said. "I'll get the uniform ready. Just let me know when I need to be there." Mike assured him that he would keep him informed, and after a bit more discussion, they wrapped up the meeting. John was left alone once again, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with the support of his family and friends, he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. The following morning, John awoke with a sense of unease. The memories of the previous day's revelations still weighed heavily on his mind, but he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on them. He had a mission to complete, and this time, the battlefield was his own life. After getting dressed, he headed to the kitchen where his mother had prepared a hearty breakfast. but he could barely stomach the blast. His mind kept replaying the conversation between Sandra and Eric, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. As he sipped his coffee, John's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His father, Bob, opened it to find George standing on the porch, his expression serious. "Morning, John. I've got some news," George said as he stepped inside, removing his hat. John set his coffee down, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "What is it?" George sighed, taking a seat across from John. "Sandra and Eric were served with the divorce papers this morning. They didn't take it well, as expected. Eric threatened to fight it, but the restraining order keeps them from coming near you. However, there's something else you need to know." John's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" "We've confirmed that Sandra has been trying to access your military accounts online. She was unsuccessful because you removed her name, but it shows she's getting desperate. I've talked to Mike, and we're making sure everything is locked down tight. She won't be able to touch a cent of your money." John nodded, his jaw clenched. "She's not going to get away with this. I won't let her." George placed a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. "We've got your back, John. You just focus on getting better and preparing for the court date. We'll take care of the rest." The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Mike McGregor, holding a stack of documents. His expression was a mix of determination and concern. "Morning," Mike said as he entered. "I've got some updates on the legal front. First, the firm has agreed to our initial settlement proposal. They're eager to avoid a public scandal, so they're willing to pay up. As for Swagman, we're pushing for maximum damages. He's going to regret ever crossing you." John's eyes narrowed. "Good. He deserves everything that's coming to him." Mike handed John the documents. "I need you to sign these forms, authorizing me to act on your behalf during the negotiations. Once that's done, we can proceed with finalizing the divorce. The court date is set for next Friday, and I'll be there with you every step of the way." John took the pen from Mike and signed the papers with a steady hand. The sense of finality in the act brought a strange mix of relief and sorrow. His marriage was truly over, but with its end came the promise of a new beginning. As the morning wore on, John found himself alone again, his thoughts drifting to Sandra. The woman he had once loved was now a stranger to him, someone who had betrayed his trust in the most painful way possible. He knew he had to move on, but the memories of their time together haunted him. In an attempt to clear his mind, John decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He grabbed his cane and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The familiar sights and sounds of his old neighborhood brought a sense of comfort, a reminder that not everything in his life had changed. As he walked, John thought about the future. The shop where he had worked before his deployment was still waiting for him, and Old Man Wilkins had been more than generous in keeping his job open. But there was something else, someone else, who occupied his thoughts. Amelia. He couldn't deny the growing feelings he had for her. She had been a beacon of light in his darkest moments, offering comfort and understanding when he needed it most. The thought of her brought a warmth to his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. By the time John returned home, he had made up his mind. He was going to pursue his feelings for Amelia, but he would take it slow. They both had their own wounds to heal, and he didn't want to rush into anything without being sure. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. John spent hours polishing his dress blues, making sure every detail was perfect for the upcoming court date. Amelia, true to her word, stayed by his side, helping him with the house and offering a listening ear when he needed to talk. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. John stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his uniform, his medals gleaming against the crisp fabric. He felt a surge of pride as he looked at himself, a reminder of everything he had accomplished and endured. When he emerged from his room, Amelia was waiting for him, looking stunning in a simple but elegant dress. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of him in his uniform. "Wow, John, you look incredible," she said, her voice filled with admiration. John smiled, feeling a flush of warmth at her words. "Thanks, Amelia. You look amazing too." As they drove to the courthouse, John's thoughts were a mix of anticipation and determination. This was the final step in ending his marriage and closing that chapter of his life. But more importantly, it was the beginning of something new, something better. When they arrived at the courthouse, John was surprised to see a group of Marines from his unit waiting outside. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts were among them, along with several others who had served with John in Vietnam. Their presence filled him with a sense of camaraderie and support that he hadn't realized he needed. Sergeant Harkness, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson greeted him with a firm handshake. "We're here to show our support. You've got the full weight of the Corps behind you today." John felt a lump in his throat as he nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. It means a lot to have you all here." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Sandra and Eric sat on one side, while John and his supporters took the other. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, John's focus sharpened. He listened intently as Mike presented their case, laying out the evidence of Sandra's infidelity, abandonment, and financial misconduct. When it was Sandra's turn to speak, she looked pale and nervous. Her voice trembled as she admitted to the affair and her actions, but she tried to portray herself as a victim, claiming that loneliness and desperation had driven her to betray John. The judge, however, was unsympathetic. He rejected Sandra's attempts to gain sympathy, instead focusing on the facts of the case. Eric's arrogance was on full display as he tried to defend their actions, but it only served to further incriminate them in the eyes of the court. In the end, the judge ruled in John's favor on every count. He granted the divorce, awarded John the house, and ordered Sandra to return the money she had taken. Eric was hit with a hefty fine and the possibility of further legal action. As the judge finalized the ruling, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. The chapter of his life that had been marked by betrayal and pain was now behind him, and he was free to move forward. After the hearing, John was surrounded by his fellow Marines, who congratulated him on the outcome. Amelia stood by his side, her hand in his, as they left the courthouse together. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, John felt hopeful about the future. As they walked to the car, Amelia looked up at him, her eyes shining with affection. "You did it, John. It's all behind you now." John squeezed her hand, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it is. And I couldn't have done it without you." They drove home in a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, John turned to Amelia, his expression serious. "I've been thinking, Amelia, about us. I want to take things slow, but I want to be with you. I care about you a lot, and I think we could have something really special." Amelia's eyes softened, and she reached up to cup his face, her touch gentle. "I feel the same way, John. We'll take it one step at a time, but I'm not going anywhere." John leaned down and kissed her, a kiss filled with all the emotions he had been holding back. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of healing, and of the promise of a future filled with hope and love. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, John knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the strength and resilience that had carried him through the darkest times. With Amelia by his side, he was ready to build a new life, one filled with happiness and the love he had longed for. The days following the court hearing felt like a fresh start for John. With the weight of the divorce lifted, he began to focus on rebuilding his life. Amelia remained a constant presence, providing support and companionship that he hadn't realized he needed. They spent their days working on the house, making it feel like a home again, and their evenings were filled with quiet moments, sharing stories of their pasts. One evening, after a particularly long day at the shop, John and Amelia sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with colors, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, beauty could still emerge. John's hand found Amelia's, and he held it gently. "I've been thinking," John began, his voice steady but contemplative, "about everything that's happened, and where we g." Amelia turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and awe. John took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "For so long, my life was about duty to my country, duty to my family. And then, when everything fell apart with Sandra, I didn't know where to turn. But you've been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. You've shown me that there's more to life than just what I lost." Amelia squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't want to lose you too," John said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I know we've both been through a lot, and I don't want to rush anything, but I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." Amelia's eyes glistened with emotion, and she leaned in closer to him. "John, I feel the same way. I've been through my own share of pain, but with you it's different. I feel safe, and I feel like I can finally be myself. I want to be with you too, and I'm willing to take it one step at a time, as long as we're in this together." John felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He leaned down and kissed Amelia, a slow, tender kiss that held all the promises they were making to each other. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "Let's do this," then John said with a small smile. "Let's see where this journey takes us." The days turned into weeks, and the bond between John and Amelia only grew stronger. They settled into a routine, one that felt natural and right. Amelia started working at Old Man Wilkins' shop, proving herself to be invaluable not only as a secretary but also as someone who could hold her own when it came to car repairs. The old man, tough as nails on the outside, had a soft spot for Amelia and treated her like the daughter he never had. John's recovery continued steadily, and with Amelia's help he started to regain his strength. They spent weekends exploring the countryside, taking long drives in John's pickup, and sharing quiet moments by the lakeside. It wasn't long before the townsfolk noticed the change in John, how he seemed happier, more at peace, with a new sense of purpose. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves were just starting to turn, John decided it was time to take the next step. He had been carrying a small box in his pocket for weeks, waiting for the right moment. That day, as they walked hand in hand through the woods near John's home, he knew the time had come. They reached a clearing, where the sun filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow on the ground. John stopped, turning to face Amelia, his heart pounding in his chest. "Amelia," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've been thinking about this for a while now. You've brought so much light into my life, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. I know we said we'd take things slow, but I don't want to wait any longer. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." With that, John pulled the small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. Amelia gasped, her hands covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "John, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Say you'll marry me," John said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. Amelia's tears spilled over, and she nodded, her smile brightening her entire face. "Yes, John. Yes, I'll marry you." John slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced, holding each other tightly as the world around them seemed to stand still. It was a moment of pure happiness, the culmination of everything they had been through, and the beginning of something new and beautiful. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the backyard of John's parents' home. The leaves had turned a brilliant array of colors, creating a picturesque backdrop for their special day. Amelia wore a simple white dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers, while John stood tall in his dress blues, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. Their closest friends and family gathered to witness the ceremony, including Old Man Wilkins, who gruffly admitted he had never been prouder. Even the Marines from John's unit made an appearance, standing in full uniform to honor their brother's big day. As they exchanged vows, John couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain, the loss, the betrayals that had all led him to Amelia, the woman who had healed his heart and shown him the true meaning of love. When the ceremony ended and the guests erupted into cheers, John kissed his new wife, a kiss filled with love, gratitude, and the promise of a lifetime together. The reception that followed was filled with laughter and joy. John's mother had prepared a feast, and the guests danced and celebrated well into the evening. At one point, John's father pulled him aside, a proud smile on his face. "You've come a long way, son," Bob said, his voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. And Amelia, she's a keeper." John smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you and Mom. And you're right, Amelia's the best thing that's ever happened to me." As the night drew to a close, John and Amelia stood together, watching the stars twinkle in the sky. The guests had all gone home, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of the leaves and the distant calls of the night creatures. Amelia leaned her head on John's shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. "It's been a perfect day," she whispered. John wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "It really has," he agreed. "And it's just the beginning." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, John knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. He had finally found the love and happiness he had always longed for, and with Amelia by his side, he knew that he could conquer anything. The months passed quickly, and soon John and Amelia settled into married life. They continued working at the shop, with John eventually taking over after Old Man Wilkins passed away, leaving the business to him. Together, they built a life filled with love, hard work, and the joys of a close-knit community. Years later, as they sat on their porch, now with children playing in the yard, John reflected on how far he had come. The memories of his time in Vietnam, the betrayal by Sandra, and the pain of those dark days still lingered, but they no longer had power over him. He had found peace, love, and a sense of purpose with Amelia and their family. And as the sun set on another day, casting a golden glow over their home, John knew that he had been given a second chance at life, a chance to love, to be loved, and to live a life filled with meaning, and he would cherish it every day, for the rest of his life. Years passed, and John and Amelia's life together blossomed in ways they had never imagined. The small shop that John had inherited from Old Man Wilkins became a thriving business under their care. John's expertise as a mechanic and Amelia's sharp mind for business brought in more clients than they could have ever anticipated. They were a team, both in business and in life, and their bond only grew stronger with time. Their family expanded too. Amelia gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Daniel, just a year after their wedding. Holding their son for the first time, John felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment and joy. He had once thought that happiness was out of reach, but as he cradled his newborn son in his arms, he realized that his life had come full circle. As Daniel grew, so did their family. 2 years later, Amelia gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Grace. Their home was filled with the laughter and chaos that only young children could bring. John found himself relishing the simple moments playing catch with Daniel in the yard, reading bedtime stories to Grace, and watching Amelia as she doted on their children with a love that seemed boundless. The town had watched as John rebuilt his life, and many saw him as a symbol of resilience and hope. He became more involved in the community, volunteering his time at local events and mentoring young men who were struggling to find their way, just as he once had. His experiences in Vietnam, the betrayal he had endured, and the redemption he had found with Amelia gave him a unique perspective, one that he shared generously with those who sought his guidance. One summer evening, after a long day at the shop, John sat on the porch with Amelia, their children playing in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. It was one of those moments that felt almost perfect, peaceful, content, and full of love. "You know," John began, his voice soft, "I never thought I'd have this. A family, a home, this kind of peace." Amelia smiled, her hand resting on his. "You deserve it, John. We both do. After everything we've been through, this is our reward." John nodded, his eyes following Daniel and Grace as they chased fireflies in the fading light. "I used to think about all the things I lost my friends in the war, the life I thought I'd have with Sandra, but now I see that everything led me here, to you, to our children. I wouldn't trade this for anything." Amelia leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I wouldn't trade you for anything, John. You've given me so much love, a family, a life I'm proud of. I never imagined I'd be this happy." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and John felt a deep sense of contentment. He had been through hell and back, but he had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and surrounded by love. As the years went on, Daniel and Grace grew into remarkable young adults. Daniel inherited his father's mechanical skills and eventually took over the shop, continuing the family business. Grace, with her mother's intelligence and compassion, pursued a career in nursing, dedicated to helping others. John and Amelia watched with pride as their children carved out their own paths, knowing they had raised them well. John's time in the reserves ended with his retirement as a master gunnery sergeant, a title he carried with pride. The memories of Vietnam never completely faded, but he had learned to live with them, finding solace in the life he had built. He occasionally spoke at local events, sharing his story with younger generations, emphasizing the importance of resilience, duty, and the power of love. In their later years, John and Amelia traveled more, visiting places they had always dreamed of seeing. They explored the country, relishing the freedom that came with their new chapter of life. Every journey they took, every sunset they watched together, was a testament to the love they had found and the life they had built. One evening, after returning from a trip to the Grand Canyon, John and Amelia sat on their porch, just as they had done so many times before. The sun was setting, and the familiar golden light bathed their home in warmth. John reached out and took Amelia's hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding ring she wore. "Amelia," John began, his voice filled with emotion, "you've been the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful every single day." Amelia smiled, her eyes shining with love. "And I'm grateful for you, John. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. You've been my partner, my love, my everything." They sat together, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue as the stars began to appear. Their journey had been long, filled with challenges and triumphs, but they had faced it all together, and as they sat there, hand in hand, they knew that whatever time they had left, they would spend it side by side, just as they always had. The years continued to pass, and as John and Amelia entered their twilight years, their love remained as strong as ever. They had built a life filled with love, family, and memories that would last long after they were gone. And in the end, that was all that mattered. When John eventually passed away, it was in the home he had built with Amelia, surrounded by his family. His children and grandchildren were there, and as he took his final breath, he knew he had lived a good life, a life full of love, redemption, and peace. Amelia, heartbroken but at peace, lived on, cherishing the memories of their life together. She continued to be a pillar of strength for her family, just as John had been for her. And when she finally joined him, it was with the knowledge that they had shared something truly special, a love that had stood the test of time. Their legacy lived on through their children and grandchildren, who carried with them the lessons of love, resilience, and the importance of never giving up. And in the small town where they had made their home, the story of John and Amelia Harkness became one of legend, a story of love, loss, and the power of a second chance.